Well, hello there, and welcome back to today's episode of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. We continue with market equilibrium. In the last video, we left off on this problem. We're given an initial equilibrium. This is a pretty typical kind of problem here. We weren't given any equations for these two, the demand curve or the supply curve. We were just given an original equilibrium. It looks like the quantity is 40, and the price... 5, 10, 15. We'll say the price is 16 bucks. Okay, so before we start talking about the changes described in the problem, let's go ahead and shade in consumer surplus. This blue area underneath the demand curve but above the price. And then producer surplus is the area above the supply curve but below the price line. So those are our initial consumer and producer surpluses. Okay, so the problem says, let's discuss what happens to the equilibrium point. So that means the equilibrium price and quantity, and the consumer and producer surplus if consumer income drops. Okay, so when you're looking at this kind of problem, the first thing you want to ask yourself is the change of the problems describing, does that affect consumers or producers? In this problem, it's pretty clear. We're talking about if consumer incomes decrease. So if you think back to the first unit we did on demand functions, what happens if consumer incomes fall? You can go ahead and put in a guess and play posit. If you recall, when consumer incomes fall, that is an inward shift of their demand curve. They can't afford as much, so their new demand curve might be here. So again, because I don't have any equations, I'm just drawing this. I'm going to draw to try to go through, so I'm just drawing this demand curve in a new spot. I didn't place it exactly because I don't have any equations, but it is important that it be an inward shift. So then our new market equilibrium is going to be where the new demand curve intersects the original supply curve. That's right here. I've made my line very thick, but okay, so right here. So this is the first part of the question. It said what happens to the equilibrium point. So quantity is going to decrease. So we're going from 40 units at the original equilibrium point to looks like maybe 23 units at the new equilibrium. And then the new market price is here. So the market price also falls. And let's say the new market price is, looks like, let's say it's 12 bucks. Again, I'm estimating, because I don't have the exact equations. As long as you draw this shape, you're fine. Okay, so this is the new quantity, so hang on one second. Okay, so the answer to the first part of the question about the equilibrium point is that equilibrium quantity would go down, right here, and equilibrium price would also go down. Again, if you're not given equations, you don't have to say by exactly how much. You just need to be correct in terms of whether each of them goes up or down. Okay, so that brings us to the question of surplus. So let's talk about producer surplus first. That's graphically the easiest thing to see. So the original producer surplus was that red triangle that we shaded. The new producer surplus is, let's pick a color, is now the smaller triangle. So this change was bad for producers. Consumers didn't have as much money to buy their goods, so the producer surplus got smaller. So the change in producer surplus is this trapezoid right here. You could also do original triangle minus smaller triangle. You get the same area. So, and it is negative. So negative pink trapezoid is the change in producer surplus. So that brings us to the change in consumer surplus. So on the consumer side, the original consumer surplus was the blue shaded triangles that we did there. The new consumer surplus is this smaller triangle right here. So that's the new consumer surplus. It is also negative. A drop in income for consumers is bad. It is convenient. The change in consumer surplus is the difference in between these two areas. It's going to be convenient for us, a lot of times to use some geometry to reimagine where that trapezoid is. So, like, if this orange triangle, if I scooched it up so that its top corner was here and it overlapped like this, it would come down to where the new quantity intersects the demand curve, and the change in consumer surplus would be this trapezoid right here. So it's going to be the same area as what's in between those two triangles. It's just in a different place, and this is going to be helpful for us moving on. So change in consumer surplus is also negative. The area of that green trapezoid. So this is bad for everybody. People's income's going down. It's not good for the market, both because there's less quantity exchanged and obviously people's incomes went down, so they couldn't afford as much. All right. Okay, so we are back to the original equilibrium here. So in our original state, this is the original consumer surplus here. This is the original producer surplus down here. And now the question is asking us, let's look at what happens in, the corn market. If a new technology increases the per acre crop yield, so I don't know, like fertilizer got better or something like that. So again, the first question we're going to ask is, does the change in the problem that it's talking about affect consumers or producers? So here we're talking about production technology, right? That's talking about a technology on the producer side getting better. So as we studied in the last unit, if technology advances, that lowers the marginal cost curve for producers. So it's going to be a parallel shift down. We're going to get a new supply curve that looks like this. And this is going to be the new equilibrium point. So quantity exchange will go up. This looks like maybe 47 units. And the price, the market price will go down. This looks like maybe $12. Okay, so the first thing that happens is a change. The quantity exchange goes up to 47. Price goes down. This is good for everybody. It's good for producers, good for consumers. Let's look at the change in surplus. So we'll do consumer surplus first. So the original consumer surplus was the blue shaded area that we started with. The new consumer surplus is the larger triangle. So now it goes all the way down to $12 and over. So the change in consumer surplus is this trapezoid here. And that's positive. So change in consumer surplus is positive area of this trapezoid. If we had more specific numbers, we could compute that area. Okay, so let's talk about the change in producer surplus. So the original producer surplus was this red triangle here. The new producer surplus is, so this is everything above the supply curve, but below the new price of $12. So it's this triangle. Okay, so if you take the original producer surplus, which was the smaller original triangle, and you squash it down so that this original corner vertex right here is lined up with the bottom corner of the larger triangle, the part that would look sort of like this. Get a color that'll stand out. Pink. It'll look like this. So this is where the original producer surplus would fit if you squash it down into the new producer surplus. So the change in producer surplus is the trapezoid that's left over between the two. That's right here. And that's also positive because the quantity exchanged went up. So when you're trying to draw these trapezoids, let me see if I can draw a sketch a little diagram here. So in the first example we saw, this was the original equilibrium and demand went down. What you want to do is wherever the new quantity is, so when demand goes down, you're going to draw a dotted line where the new equilibrium is. And you see here where the new quantity crosses the original demand curve. That's going to be where you draw your line over to draw the change in consumer surplus. Similarly, if you are looking at an example like the one we just did, where this is your original equilibrium and supply expands, you're going to look at the original quantity and see where it crosses the new supply curve, and this is going to be your change in producer surplus. We can talk about this a little bit more in class. You just imagine moving the so always in these examples, one of the two sides, either consumer or producer surplus, is going to be obvious because the triangles are going to exactly overlap, and you can see where the difference between them is, between the original surplus and the new one. And then on the other side, you're going to have to imagine sliding a triangle so that two vertices line up like we did here. And we can look at some more examples in class. Okay. Okay, so here are a couple of summary points for what we've covered so far. When you are looking at a graphical problem like we've been doing about a change in equilibrium, you first want to ask, does this change affect the consumer or the producer? If it's a consumer, you're going to adjust the demand curve. If it's the producer, you're going to shift the supply curve. Next thing you want to ask is, does the change described in the problem cause the curve in question to shift outwards or inwards? So some things on the consumer side that cause the demand curve to shift out would be like income increasing, or people's taste for a good, like the good becomes more popular for some reason. That would be an outward shift. If the price of a substitute goes up, that will shift demand for this good outwards. On the supply side, it could be some things that would cause supply curve to shift outwards might be costs go down, like wage rate or rental rate, or there's an advance in technology. in the next video, we're going to look at what do combinations of changes look like. So I'll see you in just a minute.